Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today we have a emergency off-the-cuff episode with Justin from Empty Chairs. As a gay ex-Catholic and a gay current Catholic, today we're going to be talking about Pope Francis's passing and the legacy that he leaves behind on queer issues, some of his highlight reels on the good things, the bad things, where we hope the church is going through here. We're both Catholics that have been well-formed in the faith, know the documents. Today might be a little bit of a nerdy discussion, but give you guys from the outside a perspective on what's happening in. And this is all happening Monday, the afternoon of his passing. So when you watch this, there might be some crazy news out there. There might even be a pope by the time you watch this. This is a few hours later, our unfiltered thoughts jumping into today's discussion. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Thank you. Emergency podcast was not something I ever thought was going to happen during my Easter Holy Week, but here we are. Yeah, I was literally just in my bed scrolling and switched over to my Empty Chairs account and started seeing just pictures of Pope Francis, and then I was like, no. And then I came across somebody who was saying that Cardinal Sarah could be Pope, and I was like, what's going on? Like, it's too early. And then came across the reel of them announcing from the Vatican that Pope Francis had died. So it was, I'm a hospice nurse, so part of my job is to determine eligibility for people. And I was talking with friends like a couple months ago saying, Pope Francis sounds like a hospice patient to me. Knowing his struggle in the hospital, even the little bit that they were putting out, I knew that we were not looking at years and years left with him. So I was shocked this morning, but I wasn't surprised at what happened, if that makes sense. Yeah.
When it was surprising to see him overcome this last bout, because he was out for like 4 weeks in the hospital, and it was kind of just assumed that he was toast, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And then he made his final hurrah, got through Holy Week, and it was tragic to see him go, but he's also lived a long life and has done a lot of work within the church. And so today we're kind of going to be going through his track record / legacy, specifically when it relates to queer and Catholic issues. Do you remember what the initial messaging and news was surrounding him when he was elected? Because it was the media firestorm once he was elected, and how he was going to change the world. Do you remember what that was like?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, him being the first South American Pope, I think knowing that he was a Jesuit, with that background, there was a lot of uncertainty of what is he going to do? How is he going to change things? Is he going to be this really liberal Pope? And I think that he has this really mixed legacy of at once living up to those expectations, and I think not going as far as what a lot of people hoped or feared he would do. I think certainly from a pastoral sense, he really pushed boundaries, but I mean, on paper, he did nothing theologically, which, as Catholics, we know that's what's going to happen. But yeah.
Because when I talk to people about my own story, whenever something about Catholicism comes up, I think most people, especially in an American context, think that he's pro-gay marriage now. In a Western context, I don't know what the rest of the world thinks of that, but I think people are like, Pope Francis changed things, and that's the public's perception of it. And I think one thing that I explained in my initial thoughts was that, for the outside world listening, there's the official Catholic teaching, like what do the documents say, what do all the people who study this full time, what do all the full-time staff read, and then also what's the lived reality, how is this put into practice, how do lay Catholics approach it, what's the messaging even of the officials within the church. And they're two very different games, and he seemed to change a lot of the public perception, he changed a lot of the approach to this issue without with still not going far enough to change the underlying teaching. I just remember because his Who Am I to Judge came pretty soon after his election.
I think it was July, because he was elected in March of 2013. And then I think Who Am I to Judge came in July of 2013.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you want to walk us through what he said and what kind of or maybe walk us through what he said, how the media took it, and then maybe a more technical dissection of what he technically said?
Yeah. So I'm just going to pull up the quote here. And the little bit before. So he said, press are asking Pope Francis about, queer people, gay people, and he just responded, if they accept the Lord and have goodwill, who am I to judge them? I remember this was just hell breaking loose to a certain population of Catholics of, oh my gosh, he didn't just condemn them. And it's hard because it happened over the summer, and I wasn't, I was in college at the time and wasn't surrounded by my Newman Center. But I remember there being a lot of unease about it. There was a lot of reactionary people trying to clarify, well, no, he's not accepting gay people, all these sorts of things. And I think at the time, while I wasn't out at all and I wasn't, wasn't even really considering being out, I don't think it really swayed me one way or the other. It was just maybe sort of an appreciation of a normalization of it. I mean, I would have still been in the camp of like, we need to condemn people. We need to make sure that they know this is sin, but maybe just that little bit of softening. And I think sometimes too that first part gets missed, that there is still kind of a qualifier in that there of kind of his expectations, and I think a broader expectation of the church for this population. But I think in a really beautiful way, it did open up the door for the church to really start talking about this on some level and maybe if nothing else, his often vague statements forced people to start talking about this, to talk about an issue that is uncomfortable, people want to avoid all the time.
I think for the outside world looking in, a lot of more mainstream religions don't choose their words as carefully as Catholicism. Catholicism is a very lawyer, legalese type of way of speaking about theology. Now there's the more off-the-cuff, poetic, kind of pastoral approach, but then in the actual church documents, the number of dependent clauses that they pack into one sentence is incredible. Any church document, there are so many nuances and conditions, and words mean different things. And so I think maybe one of my impressions is that I think Pope Francis knew how the media was going to react to some of his commentary, and never made this incredible effort to put the cat back in the bag on these issues. And so to what degree did he want things? What degree did he just want to sell things / virtue signaling? What was genuine? What was not? But I think both of us who were both conservative at a certain point and then more liberal at other points, that is ambiguity for kind of both sides are be more clear, join our side already. And he kind of floated between the middle with the ambiguity.
Yeah. Because around that time, or I think it was a year later, there was all the question of the divorce and remarried, and there was the dubia, which was a formal questioning of the Pope being, hey, this is unclear. We need your clarification on this. And he kind of just sidestepped the whole, but his whole message was, we need to stop just approaching people with this legalistic yes or no. Yeah. This is the answer. Because I think he is extremely intelligent, no matter what some people, how they want to dismiss him. I think, like you were saying, he knew what he was saying in his ambiguity. And his whole point was, all of my predecessors have been so clear when it comes to homosexuality, LGBT topics, gay, all the things. He knew that he wasn't going to change theology in any way, but he also knew that the current approach was doing more harm than good and wasn't actually living up to a pastoral response. So he's go figure it out. Go walk with, go smell like the sheep, right? One of his famous first phrases was he's stop being assholes in churches, giving a homily from a pulpit. Go talk with the people that are in your churches and figure out how to do this. Don't just wait for me to tell you, oh yeah, divorced or remarried, kick them out. Gay people, tell them they're sinners and kick them out of the confessional. No, do your job. Go be pastors. Don't just be clerics. Yeah.
I think I kind of explained this to people where Catholic teaching is like a bowling lane, where there's kind of one hard rail and then there's another hard rail. Now I think there's deeper discussions on how those work and where those are, but I think most people who are in the Catholic Church recognize that one teaching, let's say we don't allow gay marriage, still has a lot of leeway in how you land that plane. There's the kick them out and condemn them immediately and tell them they're terrible things, as many traditional Catholics are very eager to prosecute that way. And then there's also a more pastoral approach which keeps the same teaching, but says it might be sinful, but that doesn't mean we have to be mean about it. Doesn't mean we have to kick you out about it. To some degree, we're all sinners. So there's so much ambiguity. And what I think Pope Francis did that I'm most thankful for is he kind of put up a harder guardrail on the extremes of it. He was commenting on that we shouldn't make homosexuality a crime, though he could have told the bishops to stop saying, he kind of like told the press to tell the other bishops in Africa to stop saying that. So it's like he could have taken a step further, but he called out a number of conservative bishops, some that he even removed from ministry in different contexts, where there was this, let's at least not bully people kind of guardrail that was put up. I think is at least something that we can commend Pope Francis for, when previous predecessors, it was the Wild West of calling people various names within the church.
Yeah. Well, like, I mean, right, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, everybody loves to quote, or, you know, likes to quote it. And it talks about that the church should be against any unjust discrimination, which, of course, infers that there's just discrimination.
Yeah, it's kind of an oxymoron.
There's a
so
great,
yeah.
there's a 1992 document about that if you want to see how the church supports discriminating queer people, but, you know, whatever. But yeah, like, I think Pope Francis actually started to embody what does it look like for the church to stand up practically against unjust discrimination, of supporting civil unions, of, you know, condemning the criminalization of this. And I think him actually repeatedly vocally condemning violence against this community outside of just, oh, there was another shooting. Okay, well, the bishop's going to release a statement that's just some nice words, but is never going to talk about it again. I think Pope Francis actually started to give permission for how the church can actually support this community, fight for this community within its current confines.
And at least talk about the topic. I mean, he came to power in 2012, which was kind of as the LGBT movement was starting to gain a little bit of traction in the Western context. But it wasn't after gay marriage, where it seems like support for gay marriage like peaked, and then he jumped on board. I think many Catholics just have never wanted to talk about this issue because it doesn't entirely make sense. It often leads to a lot of harm. It's kind of a weird outgrowth of general principles that many conservative Catholics like to sidestep because they realize it's hot button. And so at least Pope Francis got people to be comfortable talking about that issue. I would have loved for him to be pro-gay marriage by the end of his papacy, but he at least started a conversation in an institution that was completely unwilling to even talk or acknowledge the existence of queer people.
Yeah. And even just his repeated willingness to meet with trans people, I think just speaks volumes of the model that he presented to the church. Like that, you know, no matter what he said or what he supported, that he was willing to engage with and meet people and treat them as people in those interactions.
Don't they have a seat at the table?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
To tie it into
there we
empty
go.
chairs.
Yeah.
Because I think him inviting trans people to the Vatican is certainly a step in the right direction. He didn't change teaching. I would love for him to be like, yeah, everybody has dignity and like you should respect basic naming conventions and pronouns, like someone to respect. But for him to just invite them in was a step forward, as evidenced by the fact that many conservative and traditionalists got upset with it. You're allowing these sinners in as if there's not a book that we read that there was kind of a figure that invited people in who were sinners and people at the time got mad at it.
No.
If only there was a book like that.
Yeah.
And it was many conservatives are like, well, you got to like give a disclaimer when the media takes photos of trans people in the Vatican. Like, we do not approve, with a giant like neon sign pointing to that table.
Yeah.
He's like, you have a seat at the table. Now, was he fully accepting? No, but there's a seat at the table at least for people to talk to him, to engage in these conversations.
Yeah. And I think like the only, I don't know, like a drawback of that almost is because he's seen as this like liberal pope. It's almost, oh, well, Pope Francis did that. He was the liberal pope. Like, we can dismiss that. We don't actually have to do it. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have done it or anything, but you know, there's a difference. Like, if you can imagine, like, can you imagine like Pope Benedict XVI, or like John Paul II, right? It would have been a totally different message, but also it was so in line with the message and the mission that Pope Francis had of reaching out to the margins, reaching out to those who feel forgotten, and welcoming them back, you know, telling them that they have dignity, when so many Catholics, their only communication, their only message for this population is, you're sinners, you're wrong, you're outsiders, like, go to hell, you know.
And one of his other big quotes was on that, like, you shouldn't kick your gay kids out of the house. Like, groundbreaking news to, like, the outside world is, like, condemning an obviously evil thing, which is kicking your kids out.
Yeah.
And though he didn't change the theology, I often find that depending on where you are, there's the wide gamut of how people react. And so in some Catholic households historically have always kind of pushed the boundaries on let's support our kids, let's accept our kids. And on the opposite side, there's still thousands and thousands of families out there that have kicked their kids out and would kick their kids out. So for him to say, even if you want to keep the same teaching, even if you want to keep the same concepts, it doesn't mean you have to kick your kids out. And I know people who have been kicked out of the house, have been expelled, who have lost jobs for committing what the church sees as one of many different sins when they don't kick anybody else out. It seems like being gay is like the worst sin in how it's publicly looked at by the church and in many different ways.
Yeah. I think like it is, and it might just be the circles that I run in or people I've met. Like I have not met as many Catholics who've been kicked out of their homes from their parents. I hear that a lot more from other Christians. Yeah. But the stories that are the most heartbreaking and that I couldn't count how many times I've heard a story of someone or people that I personally know who have lost their jobs as a direct result of their sexuality or gender identity, and this fear of committing scandal. And maybe that's one thing that, you know, Pope Francis, like that really should be so clear, is that there's no excuse for firing somebody like a freaking music director, you know, like, sorry to stereotype, but you know, I think or a Catholic school teacher, you know, like there's so many of these people who are faithfully serving the church for years. Maybe they're out, maybe they're not, but are just so integral to running the church. And like the church would not function without LGBT people in the church. People don't want to hear that, but it's the truth. And like, this is our thanks to them, is that the moment somebody finds out, the moment there's a whiff that somebody might be queer, kick him out, fire them. We can't cause scandal, which is, and hearing people who've been fired, and then hearing from people who are working for the church, or maybe are just starting to work for the church, and they're afraid of losing their job, and they're every day it's, I love my job, I love working for the church, but I also am living in this constant fear of being fired. And these aren't necessarily people who are in a same-sex relationship. Like, these are just, many of them are just people who like, I experience same-sex attraction, but there's so much animosity and so much fear around this topic that even that's enough to get them fired, you know?
Because within the Catholic world, like with that spectrum, I've been on, when I was first entering the church, with kind of the Father Mike Schmidt's Novus Ordo, Jason Everett approach, which are like, you might have same-sex attraction, but you are called to the same standard and you can be a full participating member. And then as I went further and further into Catholic circles, and it was like, even if you're celibate, there's still something wrong with you. You're still going to steal children. You're going to corrupt minds. We can't trust you. Even if you are celibate and do your daily holy hour up and above what straight Catholics in a traditional parish are doing, it's still a sign of you being broken, even if you follow the same standard. And you said with at least being able to have a conversation, I think one of the boogeymen of American conservative Catholics with LGBT issues is Father James Martin, who's been a historic friend of Pope Francis, who's had a number of private audiences. He's not just a priest that shows up at the Vatican and meets with like the fourth understudy. He's somebody that him and Pope Francis correspond with. And I don't know what it is about him, but conservative Catholics, like, their blood pressure just goes through the roof when they see a photo of him. And he's not changing church teaching. He includes the catechism quotes in his book, which I wish he took a step further. Yeah. But he's just saying, hey, we should build a bridge that we can talk. Because if you, and I think I gave this example in one of my videos, if you kick your kid out of the house for being gay, you can't also tell them to like do their homework and eat vegetables. You kind of got to like, hey, I want the best for you, and I was showing that, and also like do some of these other things that you might not do otherwise, but you have to have that bridge, that conversation, instead of just lobbing rhetorical grenades across to the other side.
Yeah. Well, it's just like my thought is, you know, like what do you want from, like, do you just want people to be in the church? And I think some people do. Some people just want people in the church who agree 100%. Yeah. But I'm like, with the push of, let's go back to John Paul II. Everybody loves JP2, right? Most people do. I've got my own issues with him, but I can be team JP2, right? This push for a new evangelization, this push for outreach. if we're trying to change the culture, like you can't stay in the church and yell at people and expect to change culture. Like if you're really trying to convince people, wouldn't you want them in the church and at least trying to follow God to the best of their abilities, even though it's imperfect? Like, would you rather have somebody in the church and like being in a same-sex relationship and still trying to follow God's will and at least being around other Catholics and their hope, like the hope of coming to the fullness of truth? Or would you rather him just be like, nope, I'm an atheist, I don't know God, I'm done with the church, and just be like, I would rather have just a messy, big church where we're all figuring this out together rather than this small church of
marble
insiders.
statues that are there to just fill pews. Yeah. Because I think one of the other things that Pope Francis approached this issue with is that it's one of many sins. Now, for the record, I don't think that's a sin, but in how Catholics approach it, to your point on firing teachers and people showing up, like you go to your average parish and you're having people that have been married multiple times or had kids out of wedlock, which are sins, or drink too much from time to time, or are, and I think especially in traditional parishes, don't care for the neighbor, don't care for the poor, don't care for the immigrant. Like, I don't think even from a Catholic lens you can say there are these sins that you're going to get thrown out for, and then we're going to keep the same level of sin, but those people are going to be full participating members and run youth group meetings from time to time. Like the parish I grew up in, you don't, before the sign of peace, ask like, oh, and how many times have you been married? Is that the right wife number? You're just like, peace be with you. And then like you move on with your day. And then when I was in traditional circles, you're just in line at confession. You're attending mass. Like you don't have to go on these diatribes. I remember one of the younger associate pastors where I grew up in a liberal parish, he went off on his own for a clerish cluster off in the boondocks and fired the music director for being gay. He'd been there for 20 plus years. And he had taken reasonable steps to like, he wasn't showing up to church in like a rainbow boa. They figured out that this pastor had to be on Facebook, specifically requesting certain friend requests to figure out that this guy was married. Like he was digging. It didn't like come across his desk. It wasn't like, the guy showed up with some terrible rainbow ideology. The priest had to go digging to find a reason to figure out that this guy was gay and then fire him. And you're like, that is so extra.
Yeah.
Like,
that's a whole rabbit hole. But yeah, I mean, I will say kind of in the midst of all of the vocational problems within the church, like I will say that one huge area where Pope Francis did step forward was his allowing in very big air quotes, gay men to become priests. Because Pope Benedict XVI was very specific on not allowing it, even though I know priests who were ordained at that time who experienced same-sex attraction. And
approximately half of priests are gay, for the record, or experience same-sex attraction.
Yeah. And so I think maybe to kind of help destigmatize that a little bit, but I know continuing to talk to people that it is so diocese and religious order specific of what people will and will not allow. It's one thing on paper, and it's another thing in practice of who's actually allowed. But I mean, it's hard when you come out, realize you have same-sex attractions, gay, whatever term you want to use, and then there's just kind of that dead end. So like like at least opening the door up a little bit for those people who then feel called to the priesthood, to have a little bit more of an opening with that.
See, I think that's one of the weakest moments of his papacy.
Which is fair.
So for people listening, there's Catholic priests have to be celibate in nearly all contexts. Like every Catholic statement, there's like 4 asterisks in different contexts. But Roman priests have to be celibate. And so a lot of people think, if you're gay and Catholic, but you can't act on it, then you become a priest. But there's a 2005 document with the longest title conceivable on planet Earth.
What is it? Criteria for the admission of persons to seminary experiencing.
In light of their same-sex. It's like, can you guys just acronym it or do shorter titles? But it essentially says men who experience permanent same-sex attraction, and it distinguishes from permanent and transitory same-sex attraction, superseded in youth, because obviously we know you just grow out of it. And it said that men who experience permanent same-sex attraction are incapable of fully relating with men and women because of it's a sign of spiritual immaturity. Those are all like
affective maturity, which means like a practical, like fundamental ability to relate.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so there's a 2005 document that says no. And then to your point, every diocese, there's an even bigger gamut of how that's interpreted. Some say, well, permanent same-sex attraction means that you're actually acting on it. And then some other places go, even if you have ever been attracted to men, it's a sign of that lack of maturity and you can't discern at all. And when I went to discern with a particular group, I was celibate, I was in line with church teaching, I didn't have like some terrible long coke history or something. Just like, you can't even look at this order because you experience same-sex attraction. You don't have a vocation anywhere. So it's like one extreme. And then also both Justin and I know a number of priests who are open with their bishops and their superiors that they experience same-sex attraction and are celibate. So that's like the gamut. And he, with the Italian, or he's not the Italian Bishops' Conference, but that was under his reign where they kind of opened the door, but still at the end threw that term back in there. He said, I think even more clearly than Benedict in media appearances, that that's not to be allowed. And then there's the F-bomb controversy of, was this 2024?
24, yeah.
2024, where he said there's too much gayness in seminaries, but using the Italian version of the American derogatory term, starting with F, use your imagination, to describe queer folks. Could that mean a number of things? Sure. Is he smart enough to know that that has a lot of meaning packed into it? Yeah. And then he apologized after he said it and then said it the next day. So it's kind of like, either, something's not right. And my point, that would have been the easiest thing to codify in documents because it doesn't actually require changing theology because it's still in the context of celibate priests. He could have completely abrogated that document, written in a new one without having to change any theology, and he didn't. That's my hot take.
That's fair. I want to like
push back.
No. Yes. I want to recognize the like how what Pope Francis did really hurt people on how that was like can be really hurtful. My experience, I think I just laughed when I heard. I'm just getting mad. Like this looks like your 8-year-old grandpa who just like uses the F slur in a meeting with his buddies. Like, you know, I don't know. Like it kind of felt. Well, he's from a different, and not as an excusing way, but like he's from a different time. Just that carelessness, and I think does represent a certain disconnect of his actions versus his words, and kind of understanding what was going on. So, for me, it wasn't anything huge. It was just it's
also like low fruit on the totem pole. Like there are bigger Catholic fish to fry, namely documents that say terrible things. And so for him to make an off the cuff statement, I condemn. But it's also there are bigger issues to look at. And as somebody who's been through the gamut, like him saying that's just like, meh, I have bigger problems with the church's approach than that. Yeah. But I think for some people who are new to the church or are kind of looking at the church to see that headline are like, wow. So if you were devastated by that, like that is totally valid. Also, I think Justin and I have heard way worse things from way more Catholic people.
Yeah. like for me, like back to the document. I mean, I had that quote from the document sent to me in an email by a vocations director being like, you are not qualified to go to seminary, go to counseling for a year and then come talk to me. And I was like, yeah, same boat. Wasn't sleeping with anybody, like hadn't done anything ever. I'm like, I'm sorry, what do I need to go to counseling for? And he's like, you need to go to counseling. And then, that was way more devastating than, I don't know, the Pope using the F slur, Yeah,
it was, but that was the same experience of like getting that email where you read the line that's like, even though you are trying your absolute hardest to be Catholic and you are succeeding at not committing mortal sins, to then just have that opportunity ripped out of your hands. And then you also obviously don't have marriage on the table. It's like, okay, so now I'm left with like officially nothing. That was for me, much more devastating than an F slur in a random like Italian Bishops' Conference. And who knows, maybe he was trying to say that stand up, but would I recommend saying that? No. Are there bigger issues? Absolutely.
Yeah. and I think maybe just like broadly with Pope Francis, I don't know. Like I'm grateful for what has happened in his papacy. Recognizing he has not fundamentally changed the church theologically. He is certainly, I think, maybe his biggest legacy is what he is allowed to have happen,
Yeah.
and his support of people like Father James Martin and other ministries. But I think that maybe as someone who is currently living in a more conservative diocese, I think feeling that lived reality of what is church like day in and day out, awesome. You know, he's allowing for the blessings of people who are in a same-sex relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's saying some things here and there. He's encouraging a more pastoral response. Awesome. But it still doesn't change the harshness of a lot of Catholics.
Yeah.
And so I think that maybe there's, kind of looking forward, a hope of who the next pope could be and how he could continue that conversation, but maybe some fear of, if we do get a pope who is not supportive, who doesn't want to talk about this, who really rolls back some of that language that Pope Francis is using, again, how is that going to impact what people say? How is that going to impact how people talk about this and say condemning and harmful things, not just hurtful, but harmful things, in this reactionary way to it? I don't know. For me, that's more meaningful.
Because he's a step in the right direction. I think you need about 10 more steps before you're anywhere near like actually accepting queer people. And it's nice, like you said, in a conservative diocese when your boss's boss, you can almost bank a little bit more on, because you know that he has your back. But then also, once you've progressed out of like, I just want to feel not like I'm about to be hate crimed, and you're like, could I have my heart open to the possibility of falling in love, of sacrificing for a partner, of raising a queer family? Then it's kind of like, oh, now you're once again on your own. At least you're not being hate crime, but you're not pushing the bubble to show up with your adopted kids at mass that you took out of the foster care system, are giving a great life to. It's still kind of outside of the purview. And maybe on a more critical note, one of the signs that he's only changed the surface level appeal is that whoever the next pontiff is could, in 2 equivalent of like executive orders, wipe out everything that Francis has done. That Francis has not ensured a long-term kind of health and safety for queer people within the church, because he only changed the pastoral approach and some of the language. If he had changed some of the underlying documents, which he's changed the catechism before on the death penalty in quite black and white terms, he's issued other documents, both encyclicals that have been more clear on these issues, that if he has the power, or I should say he had the power to make actual permanent concrete steps that couldn't just be whisked away by a press conference of whoever the next pope is.
Yeah.
He's a step in the right direction, but it's, I think, a criticism that many people who, once they're satisfied with not being hate crimed and they look towards having a family, it's like there's still so much ambiguity. There's still technical condemnation in all of the official documents, that I think a criticism from some people is that he can be a bit of a virtue signaler, because he says the right things, but doesn't necessarily then like do the work to ensure that happens. It's one thing to make an offhand comment to BBC. It's another to actually take on a particular bishop's conference and tell them what's up, or write an encyclical with a little bit more clear terminology.
Yeah. Like, I don't know, like just today I was messaging someone and he's like, I'm married to another man. We've got kids. We go to an Episcopal parish and we love it, but we kind of feel pulled back to the Catholic Church. I want to go there, but how do I navigate? How do I have a navigate showing up? Like what do I do? It seems like the priest wouldn't be welcoming. What do I do in this situation? And like, that's where the rubber meets the road. Like, that's where people would say they feel unsafe. I was like, they just want to go to mass. Like this is a couple who was like, hey, we would love to be an active participating member of a Catholic community, to go to one of these dying parishes people are talking about. And it's that fear of, what are people going to say? What are people going to do? Am I going to be welcome? And any response that's just saying, well, they're in sin, they deserve to have all those things. I'm just like, what that's, what the hell, like that. That is a mindset I don't think I will ever understand, that your desire to tell people they are sinners would give you the excuse to do harm. And like isn't that the thing that Jesus condemned with like the woman caught into in adultery? Like that her sin was not an excuse to hurt her, right? That like anybody's sin that you are viewing is not an excuse for you to do something to hurt them. And we're not stoning nowadays, but like the words, the actions that people are doing are no less harmful or hurtful, and could be the reason why somebody never walks into a Catholic church again, you know?
Because Catholics have this weird obsession, I should say conservative or traditional Catholics have this obsession where they got to tell you everything on that handshake, right? It's like regurgitating the terms and conditions of a contract, but like on the first time, before they get your first name, before they get any information about you, it's like, you look like the wrong type of family to be here. And you're like, how do you know that? And they're like, well, after my visual inspection of how you look and how your friends and family look, I've determined that you must sign here on the dotted line for paragraph number, was it like 23, whatever. Like there's a lot of paragraphs in the catechism, and was it 4 of them talk about being gay? Same thing with the Bible. Regardless of what you think God thinks about homosexuality, he wasn't, out of all the things he talks about in the Bible, it certainly wasn't a top priority that needs to be enforced upon somebody's first time looking at your church. Like,
yeah. And like, even like, you know, Pope Francis was big on, okay, we've got people who are divorced or remarried. Let's walk with them and figure things out. You know, he kind of allowed for the beginnings of that conversation to start happening, which drove people crazy, right? Even there was talk of, you know, with people who are transgender, having it be a case-by-case basis of whether it was okay for them to transition, whether the church would view it as okay for them to transition or not, which I do think is a huge step forward in eyes of the church, for at least entertaining the idea that this isn't just some pathological condition that needs to be treated. But there's the reality that like a gay couple is just way more visual than, you know, many trans people who are showing up at church, like a divorced remarried couple. There's a reality that many people who live in irregular situations can fly under the radar, but you know, you see 2 guys standing next to each other, and I was like, are they a gay? I don't know. And it's, you know, it's a little harder to hide that, which is just an unfair reality of the situation. But I think the question of why can't there be that same, why could not there have been that same pastoral approach? Okay, we're gonna approach this on a case by case basis. I don't know. For me, I'm like, okay, how do we take little wins where we can get them? Yeah. You're right. There's I know. There's always more we can do. But just how do we begin that conversation? How do we get things started? And you know, if we know that this is going to take hundreds of years for the church to get this figured out, then we better. How do we see those small steps along the way?
Because I know, how do I say this in vague terms? There's somebody that I know who much later in life, well into their adulthood, figured out that there was a close relative that their family kept from them because they were in a same-sex relationship. They weren't terrible. They didn't have a criminal record. They weren't doing satanic cult rituals in the living room every time they were over. It was a simple fact of having to go, you look like a sinner, and I can't have that around. Even though you are very close to me, I can't have you around my children. Even if you promise to not deconvert them, even if you promise to mind your P's and Q's, my children cannot see you for loving someone. Is a wild thing. And so for Pope Francis to say, let's get rid of like everybody being scandalized by the idea of ever talking about sinners, about we have to kick people. I'm like, maybe we can accompany, maybe we can build a bridge. And maybe that brings us into our last part on the hope for the future. As I've said, Pope Francis is a step in the right direction. What worries me is that everything could be taken out, because Catholic teaching is, there's kind of shades between like a sticky note and super glue, where you have like a sticky note and then you have like Scotch tape and then you have like duct tape and then you have like the crazy sticky tape and then you have super glue. And Catholic teachings and documents kind of fall into these general buckets. I think he should have taken more steps forward, but I think at the very least he's set the tone for how the church can talk about this issue, can engage with the world, because as much as traditional Catholics would love to boldly proclaim their terrible version of the gospel from the street corner and their local parish is hopping, that language doesn't fly when you're talking to people, people laugh at Christians when the first thing they talk about is like gay people are the worst thing ever. So at least Pope Francis has built a bridge to start a conversation with the outside world, has talked about we can have dignity without having to kick everybody out, and maybe we can start conversations. I'm hoping that will continue. What do you think will happen with the church, with whoever the next pope is? And then what do you hope for versus fear for on the other side of like being realistic?
Yeah. I mean, you already see I'm sure people have already seen the like, what is it, like roster for like, these are most likely people are going to elect it. It's like, no. Like, I mean, don't quote me on it, but I don't remember anybody having Jorge Bergoglio on their like top 10 next popes, or even, Ratzinger, or certainly not Karol Wojtyła, right? These like, it comes out of nowhere. So I think that any prediction is great news coverage, unhelpful. So I think that there is a reality that Pope Francis has appointed something like 80% of the cardinals that will be in the conclave. There's still obviously a huge variety and of where people stand, what's important to them. So I think we really are in a place where it could go in any direction. Yeah. If we're looking at general trends, it seems like most likely we'll probably have a more conservative pope after this. But I think that, I don't know, it's certainly my hope that we wouldn't have somebody who would backtrack the things that Pope Francis is doing, because like he's moving the gospel forward. He's moving the church forward, and he's done so within the bounds of the Catholic Church. And just talking with people, a lot of Catholics, even if they are like super faithful, they still think the church is not approaching this topic well. They still don't love the language that's coming out of a lot of priests and bishops and dioceses. And a lot of people who are very faithful are like, yeah, actually, I disagree with the church on this issue, and I really do want it to be different. And so I think that, we don't live in a democracy of Catholicism, but there is like the sense of the faithful, and at large is an infallible aspect of the church. And so I think that regardless of how the church is or isn't going to change its theology, there is a broad movement within Catholicism that is recognizing there is something that is not adequate with how the church is responding to LGBT issues, but then a lot of social issues at large. And I think that the next, pastor of the church, the next pope, should embody that. And there's certainly plenty of cardinals who can step up to that. I think with everything going on in the world right now, like my heart is certainly preparing for the worst, I think, of a next pope who's just going to be super hardline. And so I don't know. Yeah.
Before Pope Francis's passing, I often got the question, is Pope Francis doing enough? Would you want him to resign and have somebody else come in? And I've said I would not want to roll the dice with the new pope. Meaning, from my radically pro-queer perspective, there's so many steps that he needs to take that I think he absolutely should have taken. But also recognizing the reality of the College of Cardinals, once again, is a gambit of people from right to left. And within the church, it's not clear right-left dynamics. There are so many different dynamics that I would not want to roll the dice if I was in charge of Pope Francis's resignation or not. Because hopefully he's provided a direction for the cardinals and a direction for the church. But like you said, every time somebody's tried to predict the Pope, it doesn't work out. And there have been plenty of surprises, whether it's John the 23rd or JP2 or Benedict or Francis now. Nobody predicted those. The betting markets didn't have an accurate understanding of what happens in the conclave.
Yeah.
And in many ways, all popes are very surprising because they have such wide control. Right? They don't have really checks and balances. They're in office for a very long time, over the case of years or even decades, and so many different things can change. And with the cardinals, I often think that lay Catholics know more about the other cardinals than the cardinals do about the other cardinals, because internet commentators have like evaluated like who are the top 12 and what would they say on this, and then all the other cardinals are just busy, like they have jobs unlike half of Catholic Twitter.
Yeah.
And so they're not showing up to the Vatican like, oh, I've read like 12 books about you. I've read your book. I know what you said about that controversy in your random home country about that thing. I know where this guy went to seminary. and they're also not there for too long. Like it's not a year-long process where they have a committee. They just kind of vote until they get tired of voting, and they're like, fine, we'll vote for Justin. He can be Pope next.
There we go.
So I hope people will be in this similar vein, but also I don't want to say that whoever the next Pope is will continue that legacy. And yeah, if I was in charge of Pope Francis living, I would have kept him around for a lot longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I thought he was going to resign for the past couple of years. I really thought he was going to. So,
especially being in the hospital for
oh my gosh
4 or 5 weeks, it's like you kind of need somebody to keep the Vatican going. But yeah, I was surprised when he came out and there was like, oh, he's back. And every time you heard him, it was like any last documents, any last like vacations you want to hit on the papal bucket list of sorts,
right?
In the Vatican. Yeah. I'm hopeful for people that are within the church and pray. Now's the time to pray.
Yeah, absolutely.
From my outside perspective, I don't know what I'll do. I'll make more TikToks.
There we go.
Yeah, hopefully the Cardinals. I'll arrive on the Cardinals' TikTok pages.
Yeah,
it's my form of participation, sending good vibes.
There we go. Hey, that counts.
That counts.
It feels very Pope Francis though to not dictate anything. His last testament was just talking about where he wants to be buried, which is fine.
Yeah.
And the only little thing at the very end of it was just praying for the goodwill and unity of all. I'm totally forgetting it now, but just of all people. And it's almost like he knew that he couldn't mandate anything. He couldn't force the church into changing and becoming what he wanted it to be. He could only kind of model and invite and nudge, and it kind of feels like the same thing with the conclave right now. He could invite all these cardinals, and they're all there. And all he can do now, from the dead is pray for. But it's just like this nudging of where's the church gonna go. And I think the question for the church is, are we going to continue with a broader movement in society towards being insular, towards being this black and white thinking, we're right, we're the insiders, they're the outsiders, or are we going to continue a return to what I think really is a legacy of the last, 2.5 popes, of moving to a return of what the gospel is about, which was this broader vision of building a bigger table. How are we having more people in this space, in our churches? How are we actually engaging in dialogue? And you can't force someone to engage in dialogue. You can only show up and see how they respond. And so, if the church wants to be countercultural right now, it will continue to be open and welcoming.
Yeah. So the church has 1.39 billion people, and then you're like, what even counts as being in the church? And then you're like, what even counts as the church? And then what counts as what a pope can do and a pope can't do? And there's this, it's like a very American, apologetic debate bro Catholic style that the church is one thing with set teachings on everything, and that everything goes right to the pope, and you have these clear-cut boundaries. But I think Francis has recognized, and that I think most lay Catholics recognize, is that the church is a giant amalgamation of things that you have to pick and choose what hills you're dying on, that there's documents and there's such diversity. And so many Catholics are like, oh, there's official teaching. And you're I know the Catholic Church doesn't really have official teaching. That's a whole other episode. But it's this broad, diverse group of people spanning hundreds, quite literally hundreds of millions, and into the thousand of billion people. And that I think Pope Francis has been the captain of the ship. It's a very slow-moving ship, but he started turning the wheel, and the rudder's been moving, and it's in the right direction. Some people are falling off there, and some people are falling off there. But hopefully whoever comes next can keep the wheel spin in the right direction so we can have progress, as my hope is now an outsider looking in. Fingers crossed, hands prayed. some extra rosaries. I just found my rosary when I was moving in my bin of stuff. All of my Catholic icons still exist out there.
They're out there. I'm terrible. I left the church for a bit, so I did a purge. So I still have some Catholic stuff, but it's oh my gosh. There was a while I was literally leaving rosaries in the backs of churches because I had 30 or something when I was a missionary. I was like, what am I going to do with these?
And then all the books. I mean, I still got my Summa over there. I got my Missal over there. I got the Catechism over there. And then I still threw away 10 books when I was moving, but I still probably have 30 books. But then I threw away probably 30 other books when I first left the church. It's we got all of the documents.
Yeah.
Catholics can be a little bit of hoarders.
Absolutely.
With memorabilia and books and stuff. I spent a lot of money on Catholic stuff.
That's true.
Where can people hear more about what you're up to and find some of your work, Justin?
Yeah, my website is empty-chairs.org, and then on all the social medias, it's at Empty Chairs Home.
Mm-hmm. If you want to keep these discussions going, we both have a Discord server.
It's true. Yeah.
You have to pay money to be in mine. You can be on his for free and start a conversation.
There we go. Yeah.
It's always fun seeing the same icons on both your server and my server. You're it's kind of a small corner of the internet.
That's true.
But support our work. I have the Discord and then also a Patreon to make all of this possible in the fancy studio. And you do a lot of amazing work. So I think we'll sign off the episode there and keep the discussion going in our Discord servers.
Yeah. Thank you.